Are you a new Etsy seller and you're looking for a podcast? Well, have I got the list for you. I'm an Etsy seller, and while I'm on my way to work for my long commute, I like to listen to podcasts because I like to learn things. And so right now, I've been listening to quite a lot of channels and podcasts about selling on Etsy and entrepreneurship, and I've got my list of podcasts that I'd like to share with you guys. Now, I've broken up this list into kind of my favorites about Etsy, basic ones about entrepreneurships, and then some newer podcasts or newer to me podcasts that I'm trying out. So let's get down to it. Now, I kind of just listen to my podcast on the Apple Podcast app, but if these podcasts are available on Spotify or wherever else you listen to podcasts, you can use that. And most of the time, most podcasts are available on like Spotify or other podcast streaming services. So go ahead and check those out. But for these purposes, I'll just link Apple Podcast links down below in the description box. So let's go ahead and get started with my favorite Etsy podcast episode or favorite Etsy podcast. So my first podcast, and these aren't necessarily in my order of absolute favorites. They kind of are, where the first like couple are my favorites, and then the bottom ones are kind of my least favorites, but they're not necessarily in any particular order. So let's start out with the first one here. It's Rock Your Brand Podcast by Scott Voelker. I really like this podcast because they're longer episodes. So some of them will range like an hour long because he does YouTube podcasts, and then so they're available on his YouTube channel, and then we get the audio on podcasts. And I actually like longer podcasts just because I kind of have a long commute sometimes, and so I like to have it ready to go. Yeah, so I like it because they're longer podcasts, and he touches on Etsy and YouTube right now, and he has a lot of actionable steps, and he does have like a podcast host. I really like this podcast because it has a lot of actionable steps. Next on the list is How to Sell Your Stuff on Etsy with Lizzie Smiley. Now, I really like this podcast because I just like her personality, her voice. She recently said on her podcast that she's revamping her coaching or Etsy coaching package, and she was going to make it more expensive, and it originally was like $99. So that actually brought me in, and so I signed up for her kind of course because when she revamps it, it's going to be more expensive, but if you already have access to it, then you would get access to the new one. So if that's still going on, I highly recommend it, but that definitely drew me in. But yeah, I really like this podcast because it has a lot of super useful information, and she honestly just has a great voice and personality. So I really like that podcast. And I'm going to try and link or show some of my favorite episodes right here, or right here, wherever it ends up being. So you'll kind of see the thumbnail of the show and then some of my favorite episodes there. Next is Handmade and Beyond with LL. I didn't find his name, or that's just what he goes by. He does have shorter to medium length episodes, and one feature that I really like about his shows is he kind of has what's called like Friday Etsy seller news. So basically every Friday he'll have stuff that's in the news. So whether that's like USPS or UPS news or just Etsy news, stuff that's really relatable to the Etsy sellers. And I just like his podcast because it's very helpful information, and it gives you a range of shorter to medium length episodes. So like the first podcast I mentioned has really long episodes, like an hour long. And then kind of these last two that I've talked about have medium length ones. So kind of ranging from 15 to 30 minutes, which is kind of the sweet spot I find. I do like the longer hour episodes, but 15 to 30 minutes is kind of the ones that I usually like. So those were kind of my top 3 favorite podcasts, and now we're kind of getting into my middle ground favorite Etsy podcast. So next one is Grow My Etsy Shop with Jared Robinson. Now this podcast is kind of more, it is still Etsy centered, but it's kind of more, he's got a marketing background. So the other shops or the other podcasts kind of are by people that have Etsy shops. But this guy, he has had one in the past, but I guess he works with people with Etsy. But basically, he's got more of a marketing background. So it's still very useful information. The only thing I'm not so happy about is the podcast episodes are kind of lower in volume. So my phone doesn't like to, it's not hooking up to my car for Bluetooth. So I use like a little mini speaker. And so I'm usually having to crank the volume up all the way. So just to know, it's just a little pet peeve of mine when podcasts have a lower volume. Otherwise, it's a pretty good podcast. The next one is Secrets of $1 Million Etsy Seller with Dylan Jahraus. Now, these episodes are shorter episodes, so these range between like 5 to 10 minutes. And so these ones I usually will let, and she uploads them pretty frequently. So these ones I will let just upload a few down the list. And then if I can't really find anything to listen to that's a little bit longer, I'll just go and listen to one episode right after the other, just because you're not supposed to be on your phone when you're driving. So it's just easy to toggle the next one if you're opened up there. Now with this podcast, I like the information that I'm getting, but sometimes it's a little hard to swallow just because she's a little, or this podcast in general is a little rough around the edges. Now she's kind of into that like hustle culture of just working your hardest, and nothing against her in the way she does her stuff. It's not totally what I do, but I think this podcast has a lot of great elements and great advice. Now, the next one is Crickets to Cha-chings with Lauren Keplinger. This is similar to the Lizzie Smiley podcast, the How to Sell Your Stuff on Etsy. Super useful information. Yeah, it's a really good basic Etsy podcast. I really like it. Yeah, I think it's really useful. I don't have that much to say. I like it. Next one is How to Sell Online with Allison J. Prince. Now, this one is kind of the first one that's not Etsy based. This is more of e-commerce, online sellers, but still useful for Etsy. So yeah, it's not just about Etsy, and this is more marketing based. So marketing, just getting out and marketing your online business. And a lot of what these podcasts advise is that you're not just an Etsy seller, you're an online seller and you're a business owner with an Etsy shop. So that's kind of how I think about it. And so that's what I use, not just Etsy podcasts, but other e-commerce brand podcasts or e-commerce seller podcasts. Yeah. I know she's a big person. Like if you're looking into influencer marketing, I'm pretty sure she's a really big, she's really helpful for that. The next one is the Etsy Seller podcast with Everbee. So with Cody McGuffey. So he's the founder and CEO of Everbee, I believe. And I just found this really helpful because Everbee is a Etsy SEO platform and tool. And so this just has really good interviews with him interviewing Etsy sellers or just people in that realm. I think it's pretty good. They're fine. This one, I think also the volume is a little low on each episode, but it's good. Next one is The Product Boss with Jacqueline Snyder and Mina. I don't want to mispronounce her name, but Jacqueline and Mina. This is another not just Etsy based podcast. This is a marketing, but this one is specifically for product based businesses. So a lot of podcasts or advice channels will give you digital marketing or digital products or print on demand products because that's just kind of what's trending on Etsy. But this one is specifically for product based businesses. And since I'm a product based business, I thought this was really interesting. It's not my favorite, but they do have some good information. And it's one of the few ones that kind of specializes. Well, it's the only one that specializes in product based businesses, but it's one of the few that actually touches on that. So I really like that. Not to say that if a episode or something is about digital products or print on demand that you can't listen to it if you're a product based business, but it's usually, I like to listen to episodes that are about the products or the things that are relevant to me. And then these next two are not my favorites. I don't listen to them all the time. But this next one is the Create and Thrive podcast with Jess Van Den. So I liked it, but she hasn't uploaded in a while. And so that's why it's kind of lower on my list. but I liked her episodes. And she is a product based business, but she is in the UK or Australia. I don't remember. I think it was the UK. I'm not 100%, but yeah, she just hasn't uploaded in a while, so that's why it's lower down the list. If she was uploading regularly, she'd be definitely higher up my list. And then my last one on this list is the Etsy Conversation podcast with Ijema. Again, I don't want to mispronounce her name. And it's very interesting interviews with, so I'm pretty sure this is like an actually Etsy business or like the Etsy company like sponsored podcast, but she interviews Etsy sellers. But my biggest thing with it is it's very quiet, and so I can't turn up the volume enough, and so I just can't hear it. So it's really annoying to me. So that's why it's the last on my list. I really haven't listened to the episodes in a while, just because I have so many that I'm listening to. But if it could get louder, I'd definitely be listening to it. All right, next on my list are kind of bonus podcasts that are more entrepreneur side hustle based, not just Etsy. And so these are mainly entrepreneurship, side hustle, marketing based podcasts. So let's get started. Now, my absolute favorite side hustle show is the side hustle show with Nick Loper. I remember I started out my side hustle journey looking into blogging, and he was kind of where I started from. So this was like my first entrepreneurship. Actually, not this one, but one of the ones, and I'll mention it later. But this was like my first or second entrepreneurship podcast that really got me interested in all this. It's a great side hustle show that's really hard for me to say, and it's an interview show, but it gives a lot of side hustle ideas. It's just a really good show. And then very similar is a Smart Passive Income with Pat Flynn. It's kind of my backup side hustle podcast. I don't listen to it that much, but sometimes there will be some interesting episodes. That's kind of the next on my list of side hustle shows. And then the next one is a social media marketing podcast with the social media examiner. This is like the number one social media podcast. So for any social media marketing, all kinds of marketing. So this is a really great all around number one social media podcast. So I'll listen to it here or there because right now social media is not my number one concern. I'm still just beginning on Etsy, and so I'll listen to it here and there if something is really interesting. But I just have it on my list. And then the next one is the Boss Babe podcast. This is good for entrepreneurs. It's confidence. I haven't really listened to it that much. Like I said, it's basically like an entrepreneur, like mindset kind of confidence podcast. I have it on my list. If an episode interests me, I'll listen to it, but it's not something I'll go to. Now, this next one is actually my first, like, the first podcast that I was listening to about business and that got me into the entrepreneur spirit. It's how I built this with Guy Raz. It's a NPR podcast, or it was. I don't know if it still is. He interviews big brands, and they're longer episodes. So he'll interview, like he interviewed recently Dutch Bros, the coffee. He interviewed the Google guy, like a bunch of different like bigger brands and smaller like medium-sized brands, and it just gives you the whole start to finish story behind the brands. So it's really great. I love that podcast. The next one is the Gold Digger podcast with Jenna Kutcher. This is more of the entrepreneur mindset kind of podcast. It's not like my favorite podcast. I'll listen to it if an episode interests me, but I have it on my list just in case. So there's that. And then the Girl Gang Craft, the podcast with Phoebe Sherman. I thought she was really interesting. I follow her on TikTok and I think Instagram. It's an interviews podcast. Pretty interesting stuff. She is the head of the Girl Gang Craft shows. So these are craft shows in Oakland and somewhere in the East Coast. And yeah, they're craft fairs. I haven't really listened to it because it's not necessarily about Etsy or really entrepreneurship. She interviews entrepreneurs in like the craft industry, and I some of these podcasts I have on my list just to kind of almost have on my list, but I haven't really listened to it. But I do keep up with the episodes and see if any of them interest me. But yeah, I haven't really listened to it, but I still recommend if you want to just check it out, check out the episodes, read the description, and see what it's about. And then this next part is new to me podcasts. So even though I have a lot of podcasts on my list, I listen to a lot of episodes. And so I'll kind of go through the whole catalog of episodes. So I found other or more Etsy podcasts that are kind of new to me. I'm trying them out. And so here's that list. So the first one is Ryan Hoag's Passive Income Podcast. This one is mainly for print on demand. Now I am dabbling in print on demand. So I really haven't listened to anything that he has because it's on my radar, but I'm not focusing on print on demand, so I'm not prioritizing listening to his episodes. Next one is Till Death Stop Me podcast with Hannah Gardner. I don't really like the title of it, but I really like Hannah Gardner on YouTube, and that's where I found her. And so this is a pretty new podcast, like within like the last month or two. So it only has a couple episodes, but I like it. I like her and what she has to say. So I added the her podcast in. So I was really happy to see that she started a podcast. Next is The Tipsy Business with Carly Zoucher. I don't know if I really like this podcast. It's not a lot of advice. It's a lot of her talking, and sometimes that's what some people want, but it's not necessarily what I like. I don't know. I'm still giving it a try. I might keep it on my list. I might not. Sometimes I'll listen to a couple podcasts. I'll give it a try, and if it's just not if I don't vibe with it, then I'll just unfollow it. Next is the Handmade Sellers podcast with Jenny Hall. I like this. This one's a pretty good podcast. I remember trying this one out before, but she has a pretty high-pitched voice that I wasn't a fan of before, but now it's fine. I'm used to it. It's good. She's kind of very similar to the Crickets to Cha-chings and then how to sell your stuff on Etsy, like the Lizzie and Lauren ones. So I like it. And then the last one on my list is the Etsy Success Secrets to Multi-Million-Dollar Sales with Alicia Schaefer. This one's also pretty good. I think this is a lower quality or lower production podcast. So I think that's why I initially didn't have it on my list, but I wanted to try it out again. It's good. I kind of go on binges where like for a couple days I'll go with one podcast or one show, and then the next ones I'll try other shows. So this is kind of the one I'm on right now. So it's pretty good. That's my list of my many podcasts that I have on my list and the ones I'm listening to right now. If you're looking for just a basic podcast to listen to just for fun, I highly recommend Stuff You Should Know. It's with Chuck Bryan and Josh. Oh my gosh, I listen to it all the time. I've been listening to it for years. Chuck and Josh. Man, I can't believe I forgot his last name. Anyways, with Chuck and Josh, listening to it for years. It's a really high quality show. It's like widely known, wins a lot of awards. It's been going on for like 13, 14 years. It's just a basic random topic show. And so I really like it. It's my favorite podcast. They come out with episodes like 30 minutes to an hour long, which I love. And every Tuesday and Thursday. And then Wednesdays, they have a short stuff, which is like 15-minute long episodes. And then Saturdays, they kind of replay an episode. If you're just looking for a fun podcast to listen to, I highly recommend that one. So that one was that's my main podcast I listened to. And then after that, I got into how I built this because I just like learning things. And then that's how I got into everything else. So then it was Stuff You Should Know, how I built this, and then like the Side Hustle show with Nick Loper, and then that's how I got into Etsy and everything. So that's my list of podcasts and recommendations. I hope this was really useful for you, and give them a try on your next drive. Instead of listening to music, you can pop on a podcast, or when you're doing dishes or cleaning or doing chores or anything, you just have time to listen to something, give podcasts a try. Thanks for watching.